Greetings, Shabbat Shalom, good Sabbath to those of you who are watching this on the weekly Sabbath. Whenever you're watching this, we really appreciate your interest in these messages. And now, a word from our sponsor. What if you're in Central Florida? If you are or will be in Central, if you live in Central Florida or plan to be in this area in March, on March 3rd, we're having a service at the Kissimmee Public Library, open to the public. We have a seminar. I believe the seminar will be at 9:15 in the morning, and then services will probably be roughly around 10 o'clock then. It's very biblically based. The congregation is called the Flair Church, very highly scriptural. We base the services very much on what's written in the Bible. So if you're fired up about getting involved with the Bible and you're going to be in the Central Florida area, then come to the Kissimmee Public Library Saturday morning, March 3rd. Okay, now I want to get on with this message. Now, many of you, if you are baby boomers, your concept of Moses very likely is a handsome dude who in ancient times was married to Lily Munster. And then over time, he suddenly began to rapidly show his age while others around him didn't. You ever notice that? I mean, I'm talking to the baby boomers. You know what I'm talking about. Now, for those of you who are a little younger than that, you may remember Moses as an animated character who fled Egypt and came back and found out that it was being run by somebody named Ramses, who when he was young, when Moses was young, he thought he was his first cousin. And it turns out that Moses later on discovers that his brother is a person who in far future times is going to wind up fleeing from dinosaurs in a theme park and then going on from there to save humanity from an extraterrestrial invasion. So anyway, these are some of the ideas you may have about Moses. Today I want to talk about the Moses of the Bible. And I had wanted to, let's call this a message about Moses. I was going to give it another name, but I'll go with that. A message about Moses. Or let me put it a different way. Let me call this a message from Moses, because I'm going to quote Moses to you. I want to give some background about his life and show you his importance, and particularly his importance to Christians. So let's call this a message from Moses. Now, if you want to think about Moses in the Bible, much of the Old Testament, as we call it, is attributed to Moses. And quite a bit about him is written in the New Testament. In the faith chapter, Hebrews 11, he's very prominently mentioned there, discussed there. But what I would like to do is tell you that if you think about trying to put together what God's way of life is all about, what his doctrine is all about, what his message is all about, what his plan is all about, maybe you could call it God's religion. What is God's religion? Well, if you look at the writings of Moses, you'll find that if you understand them objectively, if you look at them objectively, think about what's there objectively, without preconceived notions. Just think about what's in the 5 books of Moses. And then go, and by the way, Moses also wrote Psalm 90 and possibly at least the first draft of the book of Job, etc. But he's also, as I said, the 5 books of Moses are attributed to him, the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and also a lot about him is written in the New Testament. He was a type of Christ. He points us to Christ. And actually, as I said, as I'm going to say now, if you objectively study the writings of Moses and then study the New Testament, you'll find how they fit together like two pieces of a puzzle, how the New Testament clarifies and makes in a very powerful way understandable, perhaps the more subtle message that's in the New Testament. That's in the Old Testament. The Old Testament shows us, in effect, what is potentially the message that becomes full-blown, fully clarified in the New Testament. And even while still alive before his crucifixion and resurrection, while still in his human ministry, Jesus Christ confronted the religious leaders of his day with that message, with that truth that I have just stated to you. not as eloquently as I should have, but that I just stated to you. Let's go to John 5 and verse 45. Jesus says to the spiritual leaders of his day, "Do not think that I shall accuse you to the Father. There is one who accuses you, Moses, in whom you trust. For if you believe Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. But you do not believe his writings. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words?" So he challenged them by saying, if you would observe what I'm doing, and then go back to Moses' writings, you'd have a different attitude about me. Now, Moses' life is very interesting. It's in 3 stages. You know that 3 is an important number in the Bible, and it's 3 stages of 40 years each, and that's 120, and that's also a very important number in the Bible. And so is 40, the number of testing and trial. So we go to 3 times 40, 120 years of Moses' life. So his life is in a way in 3 stages. Now, Stephen, before his martyrdom, gave an extended message summarizing the history of God's dealings with Israel. And in Acts 7, we find the discussion of Moses' life in 3 stages. Let's go to Acts 7, and let's go to verse 23. Let's go to verse 22, I'm sorry. Now, let me just say this about Moses. He was adopted by an Egyptian princess, evidently a daughter of the Pharaoh. And the Pharaoh that Moses dealt with later was not Ramses, almost surely not Ramses. The Exodus probably took place in 1447 BC. If you want to get a better concept of the chronology of the Exodus, then study what I would call conservative commentators who take the Bible seriously, who take 1 Kings 6 seriously, and so on, and who understand Exodus 12, who read it carefully, and so on. And you'll see maybe a different picture than maybe the one that you have had. So the Pharaoh was almost surely not Ramses. One very good possibility was a Pharaoh named Dedumose II. Dedumose II. Now, Moses' name, Moshe, it was related to the Hebrew, I drew him out of the water, but it's also, it has an Egyptian etymology, and it simply means child. Presumably, because she didn't know his origin, she called him child. It maybe the word would mean orphan, child without known parents. But many pharaohs had the name Mose in one form or another in their name because they were thought to be the child of a deity, the child of a god. The pharaoh in Egypt was worshipped. Now, I don't know the etymology of Dedumose. I'm speculating that it may be related to the Egyptian god Thoth, Thoth. Maybe it means child of Thoth, but I'm speculating on that. But in any case, Moses was not necessarily unaware of his background. He had been adopted by the princess, and the Pharaoh, had spared his life, I guess in deference to his daughter, had spared his life, and evidently he showed a lot of promise even as a youngster, and he was very well trained, and he was given a lot of responsibility, even though he had been adopted from the Hebrew nation, which was the slave nation. So do not get the idea that he didn't know his identity until he was an adult. The Bible doesn't say that. But it does say that he really didn't pay proper attention to it, until he was older. He finally then began to identify with his people, and he thought of himself as one who could deliver his people. Why? Because he was a very prominent celebrity in Egypt. He was a VIP. He was a general, and he thought that he could deliver his people. He perhaps had a certain arrogance at that time. Well, it was knocked out of him because he had 40 years of training as an Egyptian and becoming a VIP in Egypt, but then he had 40 years on the margin of society as a shepherd in the wilderness. And so by the time he was 80, he had become quite a humble person, and humility, in fact, was his strong point. Meekness, He was a humble person, a meek person. On the other hand, one weakness he had was he could not control his temper sufficiently. So keep in mind, it's possible to be a humble person, but yet have a temper. So if we have an issue with temper, ask God for help in dealing with that. If we don't control our temper, it can really hurt others and particularly be self-destructive. So Moses was the most humble person you could ever know, but unfortunately, as you see in the Bible, he did have a problem with his temper. But in Acts 7 and verse 22, and Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds. Verse 23, now when he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. And so at this time, he decided he was going to pay more attention to the slave population, which actually were his own people, even though he had been adopted into the Egyptian royal family. Now, he was mighty in words and deeds, Stephen tells us. Well, what did he accomplish? What did he do? Well, he was a general. Josephus writes about him. Later on, Irenaeus, one of the patristic fathers, writers, evidently continued that tradition. Josephus writes about him that he led an expeditionary force into Ethiopia, what is today Sudan or Ethiopia or Eritrea, that area south of Egypt. And at that time, there was a princess. He was besieging an Ethiopian city, and there was a princess there. Now, Josephus calls her Tharbis. And she saw Moses as the city was being besieged, and she fell in love with Moses from a distance. He just was a very heroic figure, very commanding figure. And so she fell in love with him, and a deal was made that she would surrender the city to Moses if he married her. So he married her, and the city was surrendered to Moses. So now he returns to Egypt victorious. He married her. He consummated the marriage, according to Josephus, but he separated from her for at least a period of time. He came back to Egypt. I'll say more about that in a moment. Now, back in the 1950s, Cecil B. DeMille did as much as he could do safely. This was, in a family film of the 1950s, what did he do? The early part of the movie, there was an actress from UCLA, Esther Brown, and she played the part of this Ethiopian princess. And in the beginning of the movie, you see how much she admired Moses, and that's probably about as far as they could go in 1956. I'll say more about that movie in a moment as well. So he leaves his Ethiopian princess. He comes back to Egypt. But then, as you see here, if you read the book of Acts and read the account of Moses, he gets into trouble and has to flee. He thought that his brethren would rally to him, but that's not what happened. So he had to flee. And so let's go to verse 29 of Acts 7. Then at this saying Moses fled and became a dweller in the land of Midian, where he had 2 sons. So evidently, perhaps he was around 38 when, and he had not yet married or had no living wife at the time, and evidently no living children that we know of at the time. And let's say that I'm speculating that he was 38. He went to Ethiopia. He married perhaps a 16-year-old princess, because women married young in those days. So I'll assume she was 16 and he was 38 when they married. And then he probably had intended that she come up there and join him, or maybe he'd go back to Ethiopia and rule with her. But it didn't work out. By the time he got home and got involved in what happened there, then he had to flee. So now he was far away from his princess, and whether he was able to get word to her, or I don't know anything about that. But he was now far removed from her. And maybe the assumption would be that she would have gone on and, perhaps there would have been some kind of formal divorce, and she would have married somebody else down there, because a princess needs a husband sooner or later. And so maybe something like that happened down there. Of course, that's all speculation. But in any case, now he's alone, and he's in the Sinai. And so he marries Zipporah. He marries, what do you call her, I guess in English, Zipporah. He marries her. They have 2 sons. And by the time he comes home, he's 80. He comes back to Egypt. He's 80 years old. That's a concept a lot of people don't realize. He was 40 when he fled Egypt. And a lot of people don't realize that. And then he was 80 when he came back. And so his two sons were probably grown adults by then. And he'd already been married to his wife, Zipporah, for probably, maybe 39 years or so when he came back. Let's go to verse 29. Then at this saying, Moses fled and became a dweller in the land of Midian, where he had two sons. So so now he comes back again after 40 years. So he had 40 years, the best possible training an Egyptian could have, and a VIP in Egypt, and then a general, a victorious general. So obviously he's being trained for a very important role. And now he has 40 years in the Sinai wilderness, shepherding flocks. He was a VIP there, relatively speaking. He was the son-in-law of the Sheikh of Midian, but at the same time, compare that to being a prince in Egypt. So although he was a big fish in a small pond, it was, let's say, a downer from what he had been. But he was now shepherding flocks and wandering around the desert shepherding flocks. And again, very good training for what he was going to do later on. But at the same time, it was a humbling experience. And when 40 years had passed, so now 40 more years, so he leaves when he's 40, now he's 80, he's going to come back to Egypt and do the job of deliverer, right? And when 40 years had passed, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in the flame of fire in a bush in the wilderness of Mount Sinai. And this angel is capitalized in my Bible because this angel of the Lord is a messenger of the Lord, and in fact, it's God Himself as His own messenger. It's the Word of God communicating with human beings. It's God, the Word. It's the Logos. It's the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ, whom Moses confronts at the burning bush. But notice that if you go back to Exodus 3, this man who thought he could deliver the Israelites when he was 40, now doesn't think he can do it. I think I'm trying to find the verse where he says, who am I? Here it is, verse 11. Look at Exodus 3, verse 11. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? So God says in verse 12, so he said, I will certainly be with you. And, he goes on to say more. So Moses needed, as I said, he was now a humble Moses and ready to serve God with great faith. He was a great man of faith, but not the faith in himself, faith in God. But at the same time, now he's looking for signs to impress the Israelites. And one of the signs is interesting, and I want to comment on it, and because it's going to come up later. And just as in Exodus 4:4, one of the signs that God gives to Moses to show the Israelites, to give him credibility with the Israelites. Then the Eternal said to Moses, Exodus 4:4, reach out your hand and take it by the, I'm sorry, I want to go further. Verse 6, okay, 4:6. Furthermore, the Eternal said to him, now put your hand in your bosom. And he put his hand in his bosom, and when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous like snow. So he had some kind of skin disease when his hand came out. It had turned white. And he said, put your hand in your bosom again. So he put his hand in his bosom again and drew it out of his bosom, and behold, it was restored like his other flesh. So the point I want to bring out is that this leprous condition, whatever it is, in terms of a medical condition, it whitens the skin. And then, of course, miraculously, God restored him to normal. I want to comment, I mentioned that because of what's coming now. So Moses goes back to Egypt and at the age of 40. And, of course, he's able to, with God's help, bring the people out of Egypt. Now they're in the wilderness, and we come to Numbers, the first chapter. So they're now in the wilderness. They have made their covenant at Sinai. They've received the 10 Commandments, which I commented on last week. And Moses was a lawgiver, and he was a forerunner of Jesus Christ in so many ways. He was a forerunner of Jesus Christ in so many ways. In fact, let me go back to Acts 7. I started there. I want to go back there and read a couple of more verses from Acts 7. Let's go to Acts 7 now and verse 36. Acts 7:36. He brought them out after he had shown wonders and signs in the land of Egypt and in the Red Sea and in the wilderness 40 years. So yet another 40 years, this time as the prophet of God. And as I said, as the lawgiver. He repeated the Ten Commandments in Deuteronomy 5, as I mentioned last week. But what I didn't mention last week is that he took almost the whole rest of the book, expounding on them one by one, all the way through to almost the end of the book. And then after that, he talks about blessings and cursings, and there's a final exhortation to the children of Israel, which I want to comment on, and then some comments about his death and passing on the leadership to Joshua. But I want to mention here in verse 37 what it says in Acts 7:37. This is the Moses who said to the children of Israel, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brethren. Him you shall hear. And Jesus Christ was that prophet. And if you study the career of Jesus Christ and the career of Moses, you'll find parallel after parallel. You'll be astounded about how much Moses prefigured Jesus Christ in his career. So now I want to go to Numbers, the first chapter, and there you see that now you're in the second year of the wanderings in the wilderness. Now the Eternal spoke to Moses, Numbers 1:1, in the wilderness at Sinai in the tabernacle of meeting on the first day of the second month in the second year after they had come out of the land of Egypt, saying, and then we go into the instructions. So now Moses is 81. And remember, he'd been married to Zipporah for about 40 years. And let's say she was 18. Maybe she married a little bit older. Maybe she was even as old as 20 when he married her. It's possible. Let's just speculate that she was 20 when he married her. So now she's over 60 and possibly has died. I don't think you'll see her mentioned anymore after the book of Exodus. I don't think you'll find her discussed in terms of doing anything before you come to Mount Sinai. I don't know if you have any mention of her after that. So she very well may have died at this point. She possibly would have been around 60 years old. Okay, so now he's alone again, and what happens? The princess from Ethiopia. Take a look at a map of the Middle East. Take a look at a map of the Middle East, Northeast Africa, and the Sinai. You'll see that from Sudan, from Eritrea, from Ethiopia, you can go by ship up the Red Sea to the tip of the Sinai Peninsula. As far as I know, that can be done by ship. So she very likely came up from there and landed in the Sinai Peninsula, and by caravan joined Moses. And at this point, she was 59, and he was 81. If my math is correct, we can do the math. This is 43 years after their initial marriage. All right, so maybe whoever she married but was dead by now, very likely, and maybe Zipporah was dead by now. So now Moses would have been famous at this point, so she comes up and she wants to be reunited with him. And as I said, it's 43 years later. He's 81, and she's 50. And what did I make her? 16. So let's say she's 59. So actually, let's take a look at let's think about our president, Donald Trump, who was born about the same time I was, same month, same year. Donald Trump in 10 years will be 81. His wife Melania will be 57. So actually, the difference there is a little bit more than the difference I'm speculating between Tharbus and Moses. Are you with me? So they reunite. Isn't that wonderful? And you could say, what a romantic tale. But it's not unscriptural. Could very well be the case. And since it's Black History Month, how appropriate can it be that Moses comes back together with this Ethiopian princess? In America, this is Black History Month. Anyway, let's go to Numbers 12. But it didn't sit well with his brother and sister. Now, if you look at the Ten Commandments movie, I said I'd go back to it. In the Ten Commandments movie, Moses comes back and he's much younger. Unfortunately, a lot of inaccuracies there. He comes back, he's much younger. His mother's still alive that reared him, the Egyptian princess. She comes to the night to be much observed, as we call it now, to that first Passover night. She comes there, and Moses, of course, ushers her in and welcomes her to the table. But then, Aaron, she worships the gods of Egypt. He's very upset. This pagan woman, has come in there. And Moses, in so many words, tells him, you bigot, you narrow-minded bigot. This is my mother, in so many words. Well, anyway, so she is seated with them, and this is evidently Aaron's reaction here. This woman was not there when the covenant was established. We were willing to put up with Zipporah. You came back with her, but how is it that now, when you have when you can marry an Israelite woman, you marry this pagan? And they were very upset. So this is Numbers 12. Then Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married, for he had married an Ethiopian woman. And of course, God was very well aware of it and very upset about it. About Moses, about Aaron and Miriam and how they were behaving. I mean, shouldn't Moses keep his commitment to this woman? He had married her in his youth. So they said, has the Eternal indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also? And the Eternal heard it. Now the man Moses, I said this to you before, now the man Moses was very humble, more than all men who are on the face of the earth. But what happened? God struck Miriam because evidently Miriam was the one who was perhaps most aggressive about this. And he struck her with leprosy. But I want to look at verse 10. The plague that she gets. When the cloud departed from above the tabernacle, suddenly Miriam became leprous, as white as snow. Then Aaron turned toward Miriam, and there she was, a leper. And of course Moses prayed. She's healed, and she's out of the camp for a week. So she did have to pay a price. And then she came back. There was a reconciliation, and the nation moved on. But the point I'm bringing out is maybe there was some racial prejudice involved here. Maybe they were prejudiced against this Ethiopian princess, partly for racial prejudice. And so maybe, in effect, they were being told, you think you're white? Well, I'll make you whiter. Maybe that's part of the problem here. In any case, they learned the lesson. They had to accept Moses' decision and accept Moses' position and be humble about their own status. They had great status. Aaron is the ancestor of the priests. I'm a Kohen because I'm a descendant of Aaron. And Miriam, of course, is a prophetess mentioned in the book of Psalms. But nevertheless, they're subservient to Moses. Moses was the one whom God chose to be the leader. And as I said, he is a type of Jesus Christ in many, many ways. And in fact, if you go to Acts, the 3rd chapter, Acts 3, you'll see that here Peter again quotes Moses. Acts 3:22. For Moses truly said to the fathers, Acts 3:22, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brethren. Him you shall hear in all things, whatever he says to you. Verse 23, and it shall be that every soul who will not hear that prophet shall be utterly destroyed from among the people. Ultimately, of course, if we do not accept Jesus Christ, our fate is eternal death. I want to go back now to Deuteronomy 18. Here is where Moses gives that prophecy. So we had 40 years as a VIP in Egypt, 40 years as a VIP but on the margin of society, and then 40 more years as the prophet of God and the forerunner, foreshadowing the type of Jesus Christ, who is the antitype of Moses. And now we go to Deuteronomy 18. And for those of you who don't want me to end prematurely, this will be a little longer than my talk of last week, or the last couple of weeks. It'll probably go on a little bit longer. Deuteronomy 18, and I want to go to verse 18. I will raise up for them, God says to Moses, a prophet like you from among their brethren, and put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. Now Moses is quoting God here. And it shall be that whoever will not hear my words, which he speaks in my name, I will require it of him. Okay, so God told Moses this, and Moses then repeated this to the people of Israel, and then Peter quotes it, and Stephen quotes it. It's found twice in the book of Acts. Okay, so are you with me on that? So Moses is in that sense a type of Jesus Christ. And Moses, after he finishes expounding on the Ten Commandments, exhorts the people, please keep your commitment. Please, you have this way of life which God has revealed to you. Now live it. Don't reject it. Live it, because it's your life. Deuteronomy 30 and verse 19. Moses says to them, I call heaven and earth as witness today against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, that both you and your descendants may live. Therefore choose life, that both you and your descendants may live. This is a message from Moses. We have God's word revealed to us. We've made a commitment to keep it. Let's keep that commitment. Let's choose life. Those of us who were baptized, who have become part of God's church, we repented of our sins, which was the transgression of God's holy, righteous, and perfect law. You know, God's law is not the problem. We are. We repented of sin, and then we accepted Jesus Christ as our personal Savior, our Lord and Master, our High Priest, and our coming King. In my case, I accepted Jesus Christ as my soon-coming King. That was in 1968. Well, I hope and pray he will come soon, but in any case, I know he's going to come. You know, as the Jews say, so even though he tarry, from my point of view, I will yet wait every day. You know, I do expect that he will return. I mean, he's not going to return tomorrow because things have to happen first. Bible prophecy shows us a lot has to happen, but I know he will return. And I'm accepting that fact, that indeed there's going to be a kingdom of God established on earth under Jesus Christ. And at that time, Moses will be resurrected and will play a very prominent role. You can see that also from the Bible. So anyway, Moses says, I call, in verse Deuteronomy 30:19, I call heaven and earth as witnesses today against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, that both you and your descendants may live. You and your progeny, right? That you may love the eternal your God, verse 20, and that you may obey his voice, for he is your life and the length of your days, and that you may dwell in the land which the Eternal swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give them, and to all humankind, that we may dwell in that world to come, you know, the wonderful world tomorrow, the awesome age ahead, and beyond that, that we may dwell in the New Jerusalem from a spiritual point of view, that we may be spirit beings eternally alive, sharing eternity with God in the New Jerusalem. I want to now finish my message, this message from Moses, by going to Luke 24 and verse 44. And some of you may be familiar with a talk show host named Rush Limbaugh. You may not know that his brother David has written some interesting books on politics and theology, and one of them is called the Emmaus Code. Now, I don't agree with everything in the Emmaus Code, but the Emmaus Code goes book by book through the Old Testament and shows how the Old Testament does point to Jesus Christ. Particularly, I'm focusing today on Moses as a type of Jesus Christ and on the exhortation of Moses before he died. I want to go now to Luke 24 and verse 44. This is Jesus being quoted here in the Gospel of Luke. And he said to them, these are the words which I spoke to you while I was still with you, that all things must be fulfilled, which were written in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms concerning me. So Moses did write about Jesus Christ. And Moses does exhort us in this day and time to keep our commitment to God's way of life, to choose life. That is a message from Moses. So I hope all of us will heed that message. All the best to you and yours.